Obrigado.
Yeah, now we are.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another seminar hosted by the Department of Sociology at the University of São Paulo. I'm André Vereta Naum, Deputy Chair of the department and co-organizer with Bruna Gysi and Murilo Marschner of the seminar series. This is the last seminar of this term, and it's a sort of very special season finale with a stellar team discussing a stellar book in an author-meet critic session. The seminar, Movements and Parties in Comparative Perspective, will have Angela Alonso and Breno Bringel discussing with Professor Sidney Tarrow his latest book, Beyond its Original Scope Within American Politics, I guess. The Department of Sociology is delighted to have you online today. I normally believe that screen time is very sacred. We're already late, so I'll keep the introduction short. I'm pretty sure you all know our participants today. Sidney Tarrow is Emeritus Maxwell Upson Professor of Government at Cornell University and Adjunct Professor at the Cornell Law School. Prior to Cornell, he taught at Yale and has been visiting professor at the European University Institute in Florence, the Central European University in Budapest, when he was in Budapest, right? And the Institut d'études politiques in Paris. Tarrow is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and a founding member of the contentious politics series of Cambridge Press. He serves on the editorial boards of many scholarly journals, both in Europe and the United States. Tarrow authors many books and articles. His recent books include War, States and Contention from 2015, Movements and Parties, Critical Connections in American Political Development from 2021, which we'll be discussing today. And of course, the seminal Power Movement, Social Movements and Contentious Politics, which will have a new edition soon, I guess. Breno Bringel is a professor of sociology at the Institute of Social and Political Studies at the Rio de Janeiro State University and a senior fellow at Universidad Complutense de Madrid. He currently presides the Research Committee on Social Classes and Social Movements, RC47, at the International Sociological Association, and is a director of the Asociación Latinoamericana de Sociología, ALAS. He's also a prolific publisher on social movements, and his last books are Social Movements and Politics During COVID-19, published this year, and Desbordes, Estallidos, Sujetos y Porvenires en América Latina from 2021. Last but not least, we have our very own Angela Alonso, who is a full professor of sociology at the University of São Paulo, a senior researcher at and past president of SEBRAP, the Brazilian Center of Analysis and Planning, and an adjunct coordinator for humanities and social sciences at the São Paulo Research Foundation. She has also published vastly on the subject, including her latest book, Last Abolition, the Brazilian Anti-Slavery Movement, 1868-1888. She has also produced the new documentary TV show, Junho 2013, O Começo do Avesso, with Paulo Marcão. In the first part of the seminar, Professor Tarrow will be answering questions posed by Angela and Breno. Later, you all are invited to ask your questions to any or all of them. We'll be collecting questions from the audience here and from those watching us at YouTube. E, claro, se você não se sentir confortável de formular a pergunta em português, a gente pode tentar traduzir para o professor Tarrow. Many thanks again to Professor Angela Alonso for proposing and organizing the seminar, and to Professors Tarrow and Bringel for accepting our invitation. Now, I leave it to you.
Thank you, André. I think I'm talking on behalf of the department, all the professors and students, when I say that it's an honor to have you here, although we cannot have you in person, as we were discussing before. And I hope we can do it in the next future, that it's an honor and a pleasure to have you here, and also to have Breno with us to discuss your book. I'm gonna show it since you don't have it in your hands. It's that book here. And I will start this Q&A in NS session. So most of the studies on social movements and political parties, that's in the title of the book, they take them as separate subjects, even addressed into different disciplines, sociology and political science. This new book, Movements and Parties, it's studying them together, and I think it's very persuasive and convincing us to study them together. So what I like the most in the book is the long trend it takes. You depart from the abolitionist and feminist movements in the 19th century to arrive to the new right movements such as Tea Party, demonstrating how social movements and party interact and affect each other. So I will start by asking you to summarize the advantages and troubles of analyzing movements and parties in relation to each other. Please, Sid.
Thank you very much, Angela, and thank you, Andrea, for the very, very gracious invitation. As I said earlier, I'm embarrassed that I have not been able to come to Sao Paulo live, and we had to wait for Zoom in order to make it possible for me to visit. But I am hoping I will be able to make up this failing on my part in the near future. Let me also say that I was very gratified that Angela pointed to the long-term nature of my book. It was made possible by COVID because I was literally imprisoned at my desk, and only once a week I could go to the library, which enabled me to read a lot of books about American history. I've always been a disguised historian, but I have never before been able to take a look at the long term of the history of my own country, which had some surprises for me, and you will find some of these surprises if you are able to look at the book. Speaking of the long term, I hope you will forgive me if I answer your questions in terms of my own long term. You may have noticed that I'm no longer very young, and my career began in the 1960s, and that's where I need to go back to in order to seriously answer your question about the advantages and the problems of combining the study of parties and movements. I need to go back to my PhD research in southern Italy in the 1960s to explain how I came to this conclusion. For young progressives like myself in the 1960s, movements were outside the political system and were therefore good. Parties were inside the political system and were bad. But when I encountered the Italian Communist Party's relations with the peasant movement, which I studied in my PhD dissertation, this seemed like a mistake. There were movement-like features of the party in southern Italy that were no longer present in northern Italy, where a well-structured labor movement accompanied the party. The dilemma of the party in the South was that it was trying to implement a strategy that was designed for an advanced industrial country in a region that lacked the socioeconomic characters of such a country. In my first book, and I happen to have a copy of it that I can show you, you probably won't ever find it in a bookstore or a library anymore. It's called Peasant Communism in Southern Italy, and this was an attempt to understand the contradiction between the party in the North, which was a mass communist party, and the party in the South, which had the characteristics of a movement. And it was that contradiction that I used to explain the failures of the party in the latter region. 2 decades later, inspired by the work of Charles Tilly, I came back to Italy with an effort to understand its cycle of contention of the 1960s and early 1970s in a book called Democracy and Disorder. And I employed for it the then new methodology of protest event analysis, which was an advance on the more traditional historiographic methods I used in peasant communism. Unlike sociologists like Francesco Alberoni, who still saw movements as being emergent and outside of politics, I found deep connections between what was happening in the streets of Italy and what was happening in the political system. These 2 experiences led me to participate in the founding of what came to be called the political process approach in social movements, which was founded by Charles Tilly and which was advanced by myself, by my other collaborator, Doug McAdam, and a number of other scholars. 2 more decades later, terrified by the election of Donald Trump in the presidency in 2016, I turned away from Europe to carry out research on the anti-Trump resistance in a book that I edited with David Meyer, which is called descriptively The Resistance, the Dawn of the Anti-Trump Opposition Movement. It's a collective book which was written, as we say in Italian, a caldo. I guess there's a Portuguese version of this. It was written very quickly after Trump's election, and so it didn't take us into the complete horrors of the Trump administration. In that book, as you know, I argue that the relations between movements and parties has been periodically central in American history. And I argue that democratization, which was a frequent cycle in American history, was often succeeded by anti-democratization. And the first example of this transformation I studied was in the case of the abolitionist and Republican movement of the 1860s, which was followed by an anti-democratic, anti-Reconstruction movement in the South that destroyed the rights that African Americans had gained as a result of the Civil War. That relationship between democratization and anti-democratization I'll talk about later. Summarizing these 3 research experiences, and finally in answer to Angela's question, I apologize for taking so long, but when you've been around as long as I have, you become very wordy about your own biography. I found that studying movements and parties in relation to each other gave me the advantage of looking beyond the institutional world of political parties and helped me to understand why parties often behave in ways that are unfortunate for their electoral fortunes. They do so because they're trying to appeal to a more ideological movement base. And if we look at what's been happening to the American Republican Party over the past year and a half, I think you see an example of this. Responding to the movement base of the party, the Republicans have been defending the indefensible and have been making moves which are opposed to their own electoral fortune. Now, shifting to the troubles, in answer to your question, Angela, the biggest trouble, apart from the fact that I'm trying to bridge a lot of literature, is that I have been trying to talk to 2 intellectual traditions at the same time. Traditions which use different methodologies, which are based on different theoretical traditions, and which see the political system in different ways. This contradiction, or this distance between the study of movements and the study of parties, is less serious in Latin America, where parties have a long relationship to movements, but it has been a serious disadvantage in the United States, where the study of movements and the study of parties has been completely divorced from one another, and only recently, in the work of a few political scientists and several sociologists like Doug McAdam and Santiago Anria, have been bringing together the study of movements and parties. So we are in a moment of transition. We are in a moment of political transition, and we are in a hopeful moment of intellectual transition, in which the study of movements and the study of parties have been becoming rejoined to one another. And I am very grateful that at the very end of my writing career, and this was my last book, I hope I have been able to take part in this transformation.
Thanks. Hello, everyone. Boa tarde. There's some echo.
Tá com eco.
Maybe you can you hear me?
Now it's fine.
Okay. So, boa tarde. Hello. Good evening. It's such a pleasure to be here with Sid and Angela, two friends and colleagues that I appreciate very much. Thank you, Angela and Andrea, for bringing us together this afternoon. And a special greeting to all those who are joining us as well here at this Zoom session and YouTube as well. Sid, following up on your first comment about the relationship between movements and parties, I would like to ask you about a phenomenon that somehow messes up the boundaries between parties and movements. And I'm talking about the idea of movement parties, Partido Movimento in Portuguese. And as all of us know, this notion of movement parties was widely extended in recent years. But in my view, there is still no compelling conceptual definition. Of course, there are some exceptions, but the debates on this topic seems to me that they are often very descriptive, discussing specific historical experience, and often even confuse movement parties with coalitions. I think maybe this is the emblematic case of Syriza in Greece, which is often treated as a movement party, and in my view is a space of coalitions and convergence of the Greek left, right? So in Movements and Parties, you mention and use this notion in several parts of the book, but you don't define it either, at least with a now definition, right? So my question is that, could you give us your own definition of what would be a movement party for you?
Breno, you are right that the debates on this topic have very often been descriptive, but there has been progress over the last 2 decades, and I'm pleased that much of the progress has come from Latin America, and it has even begun to influence the work of scholars in the United States who in the past have paid very little attention to Latin American social science. In Europe, the concept was first defined by Kitschelt in a 2006 chapter, but he was thinking mainly of the Green parties that transitioned into parties from movements in the 1980s and 90s. It was then defined more broadly, but still descriptively, by Donatella Della Porta and her collaborators in their book in English on Movement Parties Against Austerity in 2017. Closer to my own concept of movement parties is the recent book by Santiago Anria on the Bolivian MAS, with some comparative materials, which I hope all of you will read, because it is a striking contrast to the work in English on the Brazilian Workers' Party, which puts forward almost as a sociological law that movements transition into parties based on the Brazilian experience. The concept, if not the actual wording, movement parties, is more familiar in Latin America than in the United States, but as my book argues, movement parties have appeared over and over in American history, starting with the linkage between the abolitionists and the Republicans in the 1850s, as Angela knows from her own work on the anti-slavery movement. To define the concept more analytically, it's important to begin with each part separately. Parties, as I argue in my book, are mainly transactional because they're seeking to gain or hold on to power. And in order to do so, they need to make bargains in order to gain supporters. Movements are more ideological and less transactional, and this means that a movement party has both ideological and transactional reflexes. The conflict is often resolved by movement parties turning into institutionalization in order to survive electorally. When they do not, they often split, as the American Populist Party did in the 1890s, which I study in Chapter 3, when one faction of the movement supported the Democratic candidate William Jennings Bryan, and the other insisted on its movement strategy. Exceptions like the MAS, as Henri described it, are rare, and they depend, in his terms, on forms of organization that can accommodate both the movement and the party reflexes. In the United States, the Democratic Party during the 1930s maintained this double character, a labor-based faction in the North and a segregationist faction in the South. That bargain remained in force until the 1950s and 1960s, when the more progressive faction of the party joined with the African American civil rights movement, and the segregationist faction moved out of the Democratic Party into the Republican Party, where it remains today. So the concept of movement parties is an unstable one because the phenomenon itself is unstable. It is based upon two reflexes, one of which is transactional and the other of which is ideological. And only rarely do the two manage to coexist for a series of years within the same party.
Yeah, many thanks, Sid. Thank you for sharing these more recent trends in the party movement debate, as well as clarifying your position in a more analytical sense, So I would like to move now to another crucial element of your book, which is the interaction between movements and counter movements, right? And this is a quite important debate, an old one, but I think for obvious reasons, it has been updated. Indeed, there is a broad discussion on how to study and define right-wing movements today. And besides the established notion of counter movements, there are other competing ones nowadays, right? The notions of anti-movements, the radical right, right-wing movements, which usually differentiate conservative from extremist and so on. At the same time, the limits of the notion of counter-movements have also been pointed out. Many colleagues in Latin America, for instance, use it as a synonym for right-wing movements. It's not your case. I think it's not Angela's and my case as well. But in contrast, for others, counter-movements are a specific type of conservative movement which mobilize against a previous social movement or social change. But if the definition of counter-movements is so broad, don't we miss many important nuances to understand their specificities? How do you see these new debates and new trends on the debates on movements and counter-movements?
Well, I'll let a question because it's on the same topic, so you can answer both together, Sid. So your book highlights the relevance of this dynamic that Breno just mentioned between movement and counter-movement, but also including governments. And you do that for many different movements for a long time. But I think the book has a kind of dramatic tone when addressing the Trump phenomenon and all the things that come together with him, especially the movements that support and fight for him, and the ones that fight him as well. So I'd like to ask you, how did the US contemporary conflicts impact your research agenda at the point of dedicating a substantial part of the book to this topic? Or to put it in other words, how do you see this relationship between current political events and the academic agenda? You just mentioned that you did a book on, how do you say that in Italian? On caldo, when Trump was elected. So I'd like to hear a little more about how do you see that?
Thank you, Angela, and thank you, Breno. This is, I think, a very important question, and it's one that I've thought about a great deal and have been increasingly interested in the movement-counter-movement dynamic, both in the United States and in Latin America. I think, though it's true that much of the work on counter-movements focuses on movements of the right, I think this operationalization is reductive. For example, while the research on the Tea Party and the MAGA movement have both often been described as movements representing people who are experiencing the costs of social and racial change, much of the support for both the Tea Party and the MAGA movement actually came from wealthy individuals and upper class groups that were responding negatively to the progressive changes of the previous few decades. So it was not simply a right-wing movement based on nationalist and racist ideas. It was also an economically based movement, and one that I think we need to look at traditional conservatism in order to understand. A second dimension of these new counter movements that's often added is between high and low levels of politicization. Italian scholars like Alfio Mastropaolo emphasize the anti-political nature of many extreme right-wing voters and supporters of Donald Trump. And those who support him often claim that what they like about him is that he's not a politician. This is something we hear in the United States a great deal. And I think much of the change in Latin America that we're currently seeing, most recently in Colombia, is not about left versus right, but is about anti-incumbent, anti-political ideas. And the problem with that is that these anti-political votes against an existing party are much looser and much less deeply rooted than if they were ideas about ideology. In my book, I use the term counter-movement as David Meyer and Suzanne Stagenborg did in their important 1996 article, when they characterized the rise and apparent success of a movement, whether of left or right, which triggers the reciprocal rise of an opposing movement. In our collective work, The Resistance, David Meyer and I, in fact, characterize the rise of the anti-Trump resistance as a counter-movement. What seems to be crucial about counter-movements of both left and right is that they are to a large extent trapped by the discourse and the range of actions of the movements they arise to oppose. So, for example, the anti-scientific discourse of the anti-vaccine movement in the United States today has influenced the character of the pro-vaccine movement, which calls on the testimony of doctors, scientists, and public health experts to oppose the ideology of their opponents. So the rise of a counter movement opposes the original movement, but it's also trapped by its discourse and its mode of action. Many of these movements and their counter movements grow up in the shadow of pre-existing and broader ideological movements. For example, when social scientists in America have tracked the rate of COVID-19 hospitalizations and deaths, they found that it very closely shadows the level of support for Trumpism in the electorate. States that gave Trump a large majority of their votes have also got the highest rates of hospitalization and deaths from COVID. These current political events are now affecting the current academic agenda and are making social scientists more aware of the links between new movements and traditional movements and parties.
Thank you, Sid. Now let's move on to another topic, democracy and authoritarianism. That is also part of your concerns in this book and in other books. So while reading it, I remember of those many social scientists that considered democratic and authoritarian institutions as corresponding to different types of society. And in the 90s and in the early 20th centuries, criteria for such distinction could be race, geography, or climate. Later, a wave of studies stressed particular political cultures as responsible for either authoritarian or democratic political paths. So, although not addressing precisely the same issue in that book here, while studying movements and parties, you take an alternative approach. Your book looks for political mechanisms that explain interactions between movements and parties in countries very apart in cultural terms such as Chile, Italy, Korea, and US, without relying on values or beliefs. So my question is, does your book aim to challenge the concept of political culture?
Yes, if you don't care, Sid, I would like to add another question that's complementary to that of Angela, related to democracy and authoritarianism as well. Because your book reminds me several times Tilly's book, Democracy, that was published in 2007. We have some translations of this book in Latin America and in Brazil as well. And in this book, Democracy, Tilly reminds us that in a democratic, theoretician's ideal world, democratization and de-democratization would move along the same straight line, but in opposite sides, in opposite directions, right? But Tilly, always very sensitive to history, warns us that our many encounters with historical specific experience have shown us that we don't live in an ideal world. And I remember this appreciation while reading your book, thinking about how the interactions between movements and counter movements are related to process of democratization and de-democratization or counter-democratization drove the history of the US. So the question I have is how to deal with ambiguity, complexity, and also with this kind of contradictory elements of contentious politics. I mean, we have at the same time democratization in some aspects and simultaneous de-democratization in others during the same historical period, right? And also related to Tilly's work, would it not be interesting to grasp what he calls the networks of trust as a relevant element to analyze these relationships between movements and parties?
Yes. That's a very short answer. Now let me try and give a somewhat longer answer without writing a book, which would really be required to answer both of these questions. And before I try to answer this, let me say that, and this goes back to your question before the last exchange about how political events are affecting the current academic agenda. In the United States today, there is a growing academic concern with democratization and anti-democratization. And three of my colleagues, including Ken Roberts, have just come out with a book called Democratic Resilience, raising the question of whether the United States has the resources and the resilience in order to fight off the moves towards authoritarianism that face us today. So this has really affected the academic atmosphere and the topics that people have been working on. Angela's question again takes me back to early in my career, with my apologies, when Gabriel Almond and his collaborators developed the concept of political culture and tried to give it a scientific meaning. They saw the United States as what they called a civic culture, defined as one in which agreement on the rules of the democratic game outweigh differences on policy. This was often called the consensus model of American democracy. In contrast, they defined Italy as a subject political culture, one that lacked agreement on these fundamentals of democracy. Their Italian colleague, the internationally known scholar Giovanni Sartori, went even further, defining Italy as a centrifugal democracy, using this term, a physical force spinning out of control, in contrast to centripetal ones, where everything centers on moderation, like Britain or the United States. The democracy in Italy, in contrast to Britain and the United States, had a threat to democracy, and the biggest threat to democracy, they argued, was the Communist Party, which I had studied in southern Italy. I was uncomfortable with these ideas, and I tested them by returning to Almond and Verba's data in the civic culture and comparing the so-called centrifugal with the centrist Christian democratic voters' attitudes towards democracy. And what I found was that the communist voters had far greater confidence in democracy than the Christian democratic voters. From then on, I was suspicious of definitions of democracy that rested on political culture. And I began looking for mechanisms that support or undermine democracy apart from political culture. In movements and parties, as you say, I looked briefly at Chile after Pinochet, which North American authors had seen as a strong democracy based on its party system and on the democratic belief systems of its voters. I was suspicious of this, but I was not an expert on Chilean democracy. But Chile, as you will know, was a political system with a very low level of vertical accountability. Accountability was a mechanism that I thought was key in ensuring democracy, and as we now know, the Chilean system was much weaker than it seemed to be to advocates of the importance of political attitudes and political culture. Thus, both near the beginning and towards the end of my scientific trajectory, I have been dubious about the importance of political culture as an operative variable determining democracy or undemocracy. Now, Breno's question about Chile is interesting to me because, as he knows, I am a Chilean. Chile was my academic and my personal mentor and my collaborator on several books. The interesting thing is, first, that Chile was one of few North American scholars of democracy who also studied social movements. The other thing that's interesting is that the book you mentioned on democracy is virtually unknown among American scholars. It is read a great deal in Europe and I believe in Latin America. And am I right that it's been translated into Spanish, Breno? Yes, okay. And what's interesting is that most of the authors today in the United States who are concerned about the future of democracy do not cite this book. And it is not a surprise to you that most of the work on democracy and anti-democracy are innocent of any treatment of social movements. The historical cases that I studied for movements and parties taught me that pro-democratic and anti-democratic movements frequently overlap during the same critical junctures, and putting this in the terminology that Breno's question employs, I would say that political cycles with high levels of public involvement, like the current one, are likely to produce both anti-democratic and pro-democratic movements at the same time. In writing Movements and Parties, I encountered several such intersections in the history of the United States. As the pro-women's suffrage movement developed at the beginning of the 20th century, an anti-women's suffrage movement arose against it. And by the way, most of the leaders of that anti-women's suffrage movement were themselves women. Similarly, in the Great Depression of the 1930s, there was both a movement to expand democracy, Roosevelt's New Deal, and several anti-democratic movements like the Radio Priest, Father Coughlin's anti-Semitic and anti-Black movement. And of course, the civil rights movement of the 1960s led to a widespread anti-Black rights movement. These were not only movement-counter-movement interactions, but both pairs mobilized in the name of what they considered to be democracy. Mind you, this is not the first time. If we look back at the French Revolution, the ultra-democratic Jacobins gave rise to the most anti-democratic movement in the streets of Paris and around the country. So if we look back into European history, we find the same duality of democracy and anti-democracy. Let me complete my answer by referring to the Trump and anti-Trump dynamic, which accumulated in the attack on the US Capitol on January 6, 2021. On that occasion, progressives saw the mob that helped launch an autogolpe. By the way, this term has actually become part of the American political lexicon as an expression of authoritarianism. And it's true that Trump and his enablers wanted to overthrow the results of a legal electoral victory by Joe Biden. But if we listen carefully to the rhetoric of the insurrectionists who attacked the Capitol in support of Trump's false election claims, many of them justified their violent actions in the name of democracy and freedom.
Thank you, Sid, for this thoughtful answer. And now we are going to move on to our last questions. First, mine, then Breno's, about inequality and history. So while talking about contemporary society, you point out how the increasing inequality affects collective action. However, somewhat, The contentious politics tradition put aside the social class political action relation as a central problem to be addressed. It has been doing so since the very beginning in the 70s, right? I'd like to ask you, how do you see this topic right now? Do you think the social movements scholars should take social structures under closer consideration again? And if so, how should we do that? Breno?
Yeah, I would also like to ask a broad question, but in my case about the articulation of temporalities in your analysis of the relation between movements and parties. Because as Angela mentioned at the beginning of our conversation, this changing relationships between both over time is a strong point of your book. I really agree with this. And you analyze brilliantly this relationship and help us understand the different dynamics and the mechanisms of mediation and conflict involved in the case of the US, from abolitionism to Trumpism. And I think this is quite important because we can understand the trends, the turning points, and the long-term emergence of Trumpism as a process, I could say. And this resonated a lot and strongly in me with all the discussions we have in Brazil about how to think Bolsonarism beyond Bolsonaro. That's a question that we also have in your book about Trumpism beyond Trump, right? And considering that, my question is mainly theoretical and methodological, because you discuss these changing dynamics in the short term at critical junctures and within specific cycles of contention. And at the same time, you identify the long term and its relation to the present. But my question is, what about the medium term? How can we define this kind of intermediated temporality in which social movements and parties are related to institutions, agendas, agents in a more or less stable way over years and decades, right? As you know, Sid, I am working with this notion of political cycle to grasp this kind of intermediary temporality between cycles in the short term and the long term. And I would like to hear from you, what do you think about this understanding of the intermediary connections and mediations between short-time relations and longer historical trends? Thank you.
I'm not sure you're going to thank me when I've given you my answer, which is going to be very inadequate, because both of these questions, the question about social class and political action relationship and the question about short-term, medium-term, and long-term, are worthy of a semester-long seminar, which maybe we could teach together, the three of us, sometime. But let me make a few points which I think may actually help to bring together these two questions. First of all, Angela is correct that the contentious politics approach tended to underestimate the importance of structural factors like inequality, class, and even capitalism on contentious politics. I think this was in part because scholars like myself were overreacting against the tendency in the Marxian tradition of reducing all forms of contention to reactions to capitalism. Notice that this is still largely true in the world systems approach of Emanuel Wallerstein and Giovanni Arrighi and their students. A focus on political and institutional chapters, for example, with the concept of opportunity structure, led to an underestimating of the deeper influence of class and class conflict. What has intervened? I think the Great Recession of 2007 and 2008 reminded many scholars of contentious politics that they ignore structural change at their peril. And in the work of Donatella Della Porta and her collaborators on the Great Recession and on the austerity policies that followed, there's been a return to examining class and inequality as the driving forces of movement mobilization. parenthesis, let me say there's also a counter tradition actually in the city of Florence, where Donatello della Porta works, in the work of Creasy and his group, who have studied movements of crisis, looking at 30 European countries during and after the austerity crisis. And they argue against a structuralist approach to the movements of the recession. They point out that many of these movements are movements against the political policies of the governments rather than against capitalism in general. So there have been opposing interpretations of the Great Recession, both of which begin with structural change. Della Porta and her group focused directly on structural change. Creasy and his collaborators focus on the political policies coming from structural change. I think this is an important debate, and it's one that scholars like yourselves would do well to pay much attention to. This takes me to Breno's final question on the notion of political cycles, which are, as I understand it, longer and deeper than simple protest cycles, but shorter than entire historical epochs. I think that placing movements in this intermediate temporal space is the best way of bringing class and inequality back into studies of social movements, which takes me back to Angela's question. Angela's work on Brazilian anti-slavery, for example, was an excellent example of how the passing of a particularly harsh form of capitalism, plantation slavery, gave rise to a new wave of social movements. Looking from the short term to the intermediate term, I'd like to reference a new book in which I actually have a chapter, and this is a book that just came out, edited by David Collier and Gerardo Monk, called Critical Junctures and Historical Legacies, in which they try and link the concept of critical junctures, which, as you know, I use in my book. They try and link it to broader historical periods through the concept of historical legacies. They argue that the historical legacies of critical junctures are what connects moments of crisis to moments of reestablishment. And if you look at the book, there are a number of chapters coming from Latin America. As you know, Collier is a well-known North American Latin Americanist. His work on Argentina is fundamental. Monk is another Latin Americanist. So many of the chapters in that book are about Latin American transitions, except my own chapter, which is a chapter comparing the 1968 experience in France, Italy, and the United States. And I would be happy to send that chapter to anybody who is interested in it, who did not want to spend the $35 for this very large book. I recommend the book very strongly. I wish it was not quite so long and not quite so expensive. Anyway, there we are. I've gone from very specific questions and very specific aspects of my book on movements and parties to the far more general issues that you both have raised in your final questions. But I very much look forward to the question and answer period, which I hope will enable us to bring in some of the students and your colleagues in Sao Paulo.
Many thanks. Wonderful discussion. Thought-provoking discussion. We have 4 questions actually, already 4 questions from the YouTube audience. But I would like to ask if anyone here on Google Meet would like to pose a question. Please raise your hand, and I will open your microphone. Meanwhile, What do you prefer? Do you prefer to answer individual questions, or should we gather them? Yeah. Right.
I think Angela has a preference, and I would probably join her in preferring individual.
Yeah, put them together.
Right. So, okay. Antonio Andrade is asking for the three of you if you could share your perspectives on changing repertoires of far-right organizations in the US and in Brazil. That's the first question. Then a more general question related to the former by Daniel Henrique Ferreira. Daniel asks, to what extent is it possible to think changes in the organization of movement parties as related with repertoires of contemporary social movements?
Mm-hmm.
Second question, Danielle also asks, to what extent democratization and de-democratization is related with democratization, populism, and personalist trends within parties. So how general trends in democratization and de-democratization are related to trends within the organization of parties. And finally, we have Teresa Marques. She asks about the participation of political parties in transnational coalitions. She asks if you could share your perspectives about the participation of political parties in transnational coalitions in a time when extraterritorial votes and transnational actions become more relevant.
Thank you very much for these pregnant questions, pregnant in the sense of full of possibilities for going off in a number of different directions. I will try to stick to the questions themselves, beginning with the issue of repertoires of contention. This is a concept, as the questioner will know, as everyone I think will know, that was central to the work of Charles Tilly, and one which I tried to work on in several of my empirical studies. I think when we look at the question of repertoires, we often focus on one part of the definition and not on the second. The part of the definition that we do focus on is what people do when they protest. The part of the definition that we often forget is that it depends upon what people know how to do and what those who the protest is aimed at know the meaning of. I've often used the example that if in 17th century Paris, the students had engaged in a sit-down protest, the professors would not have known how to respond because the concept of a sit-down protest didn't exist. So it's not only what people do, it's what is understood by what people do, both by the protesters and those who are targeted by the protests. This leads me to an empirical answer to the question, and that is whether there have been changes in the repertoire over the recent past that are significant enough to suggest a change in the nature of contentious politics. And in answering this question, I would say two or three things strike my attention. The first one is that the traditional repertoire of contention, including strikes, demonstrations, marches, and petitions, appears to have diffused from social movements to political parties and interest groups. We appear to be finding if you will, a colonization of institutional politics by the non-institutional or if you will, the conventional part of the social movement repertoire. And this is something that David Meyer and I foresaw in our book in 1998 called The Social Movement Society, which unfortunately has not been translated. We argued that political parties and interest groups were beginning to adopt parts of the conventional repertoire of social movements, and I think the last 20 years have demonstrated that our hypothesis was correct. The second thing that I think comes out of the American experience in recent years, and which I hope will not be taken over in Brazil or other parts of Latin America, and that is the rise of organized violence from among what most people would consider conventional movements and parties. We are now seeing in the United States not only the insurrection of January 6th, which was a major change in the repertoire of contention, but the use of violence, or even the symbolic use of violence, among political party and social movement leaders. I was watching television this morning, and there was a web advertisement by the Missouri State Republican candidate for the Senate in the Republican Party, who was brandishing a shotgun together with a number of people dressed up in military garb, who broke into a house in this advertisement and claimed that they were using their guns against what they called rhinos. In the American parlance, rhino means Republican in name only. So this was a symbolic, violent attack on moderate Republicans on the part of a right-wing Republican, using symbolic violence to put forward his candidacy. We are seeing a great deal more of this kind of reference to violence and actual violence coming within the political system, and not only from far right or far left militants. I don't know if this is the case in Latin America. I hope it will not be the case in Brazil following the outcome of the forthcoming elections. So that was an answer to the first question. Now I've talked so long that I forgot the second question.
It was, to what extent is it possible to think changes in the organization of movement parties is related with repertoires of contemporary social movements? That was
oh boy. Okay. I think that's a question that is best answered country by country, because I think that the actual institutional framework influences very strongly the nature of political organizations. In my book, which does not pretend to be a global study, I use the concept of hybridity to try and understand the changes in political parties in the United States over the past few decades. And in studying hybridity, I've pointed out that there have been forms of organization, actually forms of networks that have infested the political party system as traditional party organizations have become weakened. The term I use for this is that party organizations have become hollowed out. And I take this term from the work of a young American scholar whose name is Daniel Schlossman. And I recommend his book on parties and movements in the United States. And what I see is a weakening of the traditional political party structures and an effort on the part of non-party organizations, particularly on the right, but not only on the right, to take over the space that was previously occupied by party organizations. This is a trend that I think is very far advanced in the United States, particularly on the right. If you look at Donald Trump's victory in 2016, the role of the Republican Party as a party was extremely limited. But the role of the Tea Party, of pro-gun groups, of Christian conservative groups, of a number of social movement groups, the role of those outside groups grew as the role of the Republican Party itself declined. I cannot say anything more similar to this as far as Latin American countries are concerned, but I would call your attention to the post-2019 developments in Chile, in which a social movement-based party has become the most important party in the country, and yet in the referendum for the Constituent Assembly, a large number of independents have been elected, and to my knowledge, they have so far not created a substantial political party organization. That may be a parallel process to what I've observed in the United States. Now there's a third question, and it was about transnational social movement organizations. And I have to confess that I have paid much less attention to this phenomenon since I gave up working on transnational social movements in 2005. That was 17 years ago. I have a very good memory, but not such a good memory that I can keep track of what's happening in transnational movement organizations. The only significant factor that I can point out is one that the questioner may already know about, and it's this. When scholars in Europe and the United States began to focus on transnational movements, they focused mainly on movements of the progressive and liberal left. Ecological movements, women's movements, peace movements were the major topics in work by scholars such as Margaret Keck and Catherine Sickink, who did much of their work in Brazil and Argentina. Recently, scholars have begun to find that right-wing organizations are creating transnational presences and transnational forms of organization. So to the extent that this is a trend and not simply a brief phenomenon, we may be seeing a shift in the repertoire of transnational movement organizations from the progressive left to the religious and conservative right. But that is really a very inadequate answer to a very good question based on the fact that I have not been studying this phenomenon in recent years.
Thank you. Maybe Angela and Breno would like to add a few words before we move on.
I think we have another question here from Natalia.
Yeah. Right. Okay. Natalia.
I can see Natalia, but I can't hear her.
Yeah.
Hi, good afternoon. It was mentioned that you studied the relation between parties and movement in Korea when you were doing your comparison. So I wanted to ask if you could talk a bit more about that.
Yeah, I can talk a bit more, but could you be a little more specific about what interests you about South Korea?
Oh, I actually want to know what kind of movements you were studying, because I like to study the feminist movement there. So I was interested if you could talk what you use to your research, because it might help what I want to study.
Oh, I see. Okay. So, Natalia, everything I know about South Korea comes from 2 or 3 of my former students who came to Cornell to work with me in the 1990s and the 2010s, and who have been helping me to try and understand what's happening in their country. The only thing that I could say of general interest, and I think you'll find it in chapter 9 of my book, where I briefly discuss South Korea, the only thing I could say of general interest is that the major changes in South Korean politics, and in particular the democratization movement of the 1980s, have been hybrid movements in which the traditional leaders of the South Korean movement sector, which are workers and students, have been joined by a number of other movement actors, including the feminist movement, but in particular also lawyers and other professional groups. When someone from the United States or even Brazil looks at the South Korean political landscape, we are astonished to discover the number of civil liberties groups and feminist groups and lawyers groups that came together very rapidly in what came to be called the Candlelight Protests. And the Candlelight Protests, which went on for several months and were responsible for the overthrow of a conservative president and her replacement by a progressive government. These protests were organized by literally hundreds of civil society groups, which came together very rapidly and very effectively, and in the streets of Seoul and other cities, and to an extraordinary extent managed to avoid violence between the protesters and the police. I hope that this will be the kind of mass but non-violent actions that will take place in Brazil if there are protests following the forthcoming elections.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. We have a question from Natasha in the room. Professor Tarrow, how do you evaluate the political appropriation of social media by parties and movements in contemporary times? In your understanding, what are the implications of digital technologies for collective action? Can they be considered a new repertoire of action that characterizes this new political cycle?
I prayed that I would not get any questions about social media because I'm not an expert on social media, and also there is so much to be said that it would be difficult to answer such a question in a very few minutes. The only thing that I could say which might be of interest is that in the decade or more since social media have become important in the study of social movements, there has been a decided shift in the use of social media from progressive groups to conservative groups, which were very slow to adapt to social media, but once they began to adapt to it, they became extremely expert. If you look at the book on Tradition and Change in American Political Discourse, edited by Theda Skocpol and her students at Harvard, they argue that social media were one of the major elements in the success of the Trumpian political revolution. So the only thing I can say of any use is that although the phenomenon began on the left, it has been very rapidly and very successfully adapted by movements on the right.
Right, thank you again. I will use my prerogative here. I always wanted to ask a question about cycles of protest, and I'm generally interested in time and temporality as a sociologist. And one of the questions that I've been thinking about for a long time now is, how do we recognize a turning point or a critical event? And I'd like to ask, it's pretty clear, or let me rephrase this. I think that the idea of cycles of protest is, makes very clear when a new cycle emerges. But what about the end of a cycle? How do we recognize the end of a cycle, especially when, if we take into account that some movements become parties and institutionalize collective action and contentious politics?
This is a question that has absorbed my attention for several decades, ever since I worked on the Italian cycle of protest of the 1960s, in which it became very clear to me very rapidly that it was not possible to predict when and how a cycle was going to end. In the American tradition, social movements were often seen through a kind of natural history. They began in emergent forms, to use Alberoni's terms. They peaked at a certain point with a high level of involvement, and then they declined and became institutionalized. This was the major finding of the school of collective behavior, which arose in the United States in the 1950s. The problem is that that logic operates very well for individual movements, but it does not operate very well for cycles of contention, which are not individual movements, but which in fact contain a number of different movements and parties and interest groups. And once the landscape becomes complicated, these movements, parties, and interest groups relate to one another in ways that are not predictable in their outcomes. So, for example, let me point to the difference between what happened in France and what happened in Italy in 1968, which was the topic of my article in the Collier and Monk volume. One of the major differences between the two countries was that the French 1968 ended in 1968. And by 1969, the country had gone back to a conventional form of political debate between institutionalized political parties, and the movements that had exercised the entire world in May 1968 had essentially disappeared. In contrast, the Italian 1968 was what one scholar called a sliding May, a May that slid into the 1970s. Why did it slide into the 1970s? The answer that I put forward is not because the Italian movement was either more powerful or weaker than the French movement. It was because the Italian movement was a multiple movement in which there were interactions between different actors and sectors of the movement, particularly interactions between movements of the extreme left and movements of the extreme right. So while the initiation of a movement cycle is predictable, the outcome is not predictable because of the dynamics of the interactions among the players within the cycle that lead to the difficulty of producing a determined outcome.
Thank you. Breno and Angela want to each of them ask a final closing question.
Do you want to go first, Angela, or me?
As you wish.
It's up to you.
So I go. Since we have many students here, graduate students, I'd like to ask you about what you consider to be a good agenda to the next years in political sociology. And in particular, which subjects do you think are the most important to be studied by the ones like the students here that are starting right now their careers? And I ask that because you are at the point of the career you are, but also because we have kind of waves of subjects in this area, right? So now I see that everybody is interested in studying right-wing movements, and many other things are behind. And before that, everybody was studying left-wing movements. So what is your advice for the new students in this field?
Oh, this is a wonderful question. And I can see why Angela would raise it at this point in her own academic career and in the academic career of people studying social movements. Let me begin by suggesting what I hope we will not do. I hope we will not become deeply engaged in studying the impact of social media. And that's not because social media are not important, but because social media are so important that they are very difficult to separate out from other aspects of contentious politics. I think we should be aware of social media, but we should be aware of them in the same way that scholars became aware of newspapers when newspapers first became available and affordable in the early 19th century. They brought about a change, but once that change was brought about, it became part of the conventional repertoire of social movements. What I do think we should ask ourselves, and this comes out of the contentious politics tradition, is to look at social movements in relationship to other sectors of social life. Doug McAdam used the term social movement-centered analysis, and he was criticizing analysis that focuses on social movements to the exclusion of other sectors of modern society. I hope that the next generation of students will be looking at the relations between movements and both what we can call the upstream relations, that is to say, to the structure of capitalism and social classes, and to the downstream relations of social movements, looking at political parties and political institutions. I hope we have learned the lesson that studying social movements in isolation from their upstream and downstream consequences is a mistake, and that the most interesting work comes from relation to the rest of society. I said earlier that beginning with the Great Recession, students have begun to become much more engaged in the relationship between movements and capitalism. I think that with the current crisis in the capitalist systems of the world, we need to look again and more deeply at these relations. But I also think we need to keep the attention of scholars on the relations between movements and institutions. For example, students of political parties in Latin America tend to think, that's my dog, excuse her, she's asking for her dinner. We tend to think of the shifts in political allegiance as being shifts from left to right. So in the 1990s, there was the beginning of a shift to the left in Latin American politics. This was followed by a shift to the right, and we are now entering what many scholars already see as a new shift to the left, particularly following the results in Colombia in the recent election. I think we need to interrogate that assumption. I don't think that there is no change involved, but I'm not convinced that the change is an ideological one from left to right. I think it may be the result of an anti-incumbent shift. And an anti-incumbent shift means that whoever is in power at the time when there is an economic or a social or an international crisis is going to be blamed for that crisis. Not because they are on the left or on the right, but because they are in power. Poor Joe Biden is going to be blamed for the inflation that the United States and the rest of the world is currently encountering. This inflation has nothing to do with the policies of the Biden administration, but he happens to be in power at the moment. If Donald Trump was in power at the moment, he would have a similar result. So I think we need to question our traditional assumptions that political change is the result of left-wing or right-wing shifts. It may very much be the result of anti-incumbency and anti-political activism.
Yeah, many thanks, Sid, for these inspiring answers. And since we are ending our conversation and this already dinner time for your dog, just a brief final thought, okay? No, I really hope that these reflections can stimulate Brazilian, Latin American colleagues to read the book. It would be excellent to have a translated version into Spanish and Portuguese, because when we read your book and you analyze the case of the US, I think in our conversation here, we know and we felt this resonance, right, with the Brazilian case about movements and counter movements, the relationship between democratization and democratization. And I think we had today a wonderful dialogue. And I would like to ask you a question precisely about that, about global dialogues in social movement studies. We have learned a lot from your work in Brazil and in Latin America. We have learned a lot also from the experience of the social movements in the US, mainly with the anti-racist and feminist movements in the Brazilian case that were really quite inspired for us in Brazil. And I would like to ask if you can tell us what you have learned most from Latin America in recent times. I know that since the last time that we met personally in Brazil, you have traveled a bit in different countries in Latin America. We met in Ecuador. I know that you were in Chile, Mexico, and so on. So what strikes you most about Latin American social movements in contrast to the case of the US, and what kind of dialogues you think we can foster?
Thanks, Breno, for this stimulating question and for this entire conversation from which I have learned a great deal and have asked myself the question, why on earth did I not begin to study Latin America long ago? And by the way, the answer to that question is I almost did. When I finished my first book, or when I was working on my first book on Southern Italy, someone pointed out that Southern Italy looked a lot more like Latin America than it did like Western Europe. And at the time, I didn't have a position to move to. And I said, oh, I know, I'm going to go to Chile because there are social movements in Chile and there's a communist party, and I know about social movements and communist parties, so I'm going to go to Chile. And the research director at Berkeley, where I was a student, said, "Are you crazy? You have a Western European expertise. You read Italian and you read French. Why would you go to the bottom of Latin America rather than continue working on Western Europe?" For example, comparing the Latin sisters, Italy and France. And I was intimidated by this. And so I wrote my second book comparing Italy and France rather than making the much more courageous move of going to the end of Latin America and comparing Chile and Italy. This is a lesson for your graduate students, I suppose. Be brave, take risks. Don't follow the traditional narrow scope of social scientists, and certainly don't listen to your professors, who will probably be telling you what was good advice for them when they were graduate students, and which may be very bad advice for you today. That's the first advice I give my graduate students. Don't listen to me. But more seriously and more positively, I think I've observed in the last decade, and perhaps a bit more than this, that scholars in the United States are beginning to pay more attention to Latin America and are learning from it. It was once the case that we regarded Latin America as a backward part of the world in which there were a lot of people who become violent easily and who have strong emotions and who aren't as moderate as we are. We are now learning, excuse me, in the United States, that we are not as moderate as we thought we were, that there is a great deal of suppressed and actual violence in American political culture, and that our Constitution, which we thought was going to prevent violence and insurrection, is not as strong a fortress against authoritarianism than we thought it was. So therefore, a continent which has a much more varied history of democracy and authoritarianism, such as Latin America, is much more relevant to the United States than we thought it was. Vice versa, I think the recent crises in American politics and society, I hope, will be studied by Latin American students, because we now find that there are many more similarities between Latin America and the United States than we thought was the case. And rather than divide the study of social movements and social change geographically, I hope that students in Latin America, and in particular in Brazil, will draw upon the parallels between our countries in trying to understand their own country.
Thank you.
You're very welcome.
Many, many thanks, Professor Tarrow, for this wonderful conversation, and Professor Tarrow, Professor Bringel, and of course, Angela, for putting this together. We're very grateful, very delighted to have had you here. This, again, was an excellent last session for the term. And we'll have news for the new term in a couple of weeks. Thanks again. Stay safe, everybody, and we hope to see Tarrow personally in São Paulo, as Angela said before, very soon as well. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. This has been a very exciting and a very satisfying opportunity for me to meet new people, to encounter a university that I have not been able to visit, and to see old friends, and to assure myself that they are just as interesting as they were when I first met them. Thank you very much, and thank you to the students who were able to pay attention for such a long and complicated discussion.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Obrigado, gente. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. Sid, it's a great pleasure to have you here. And a privilege. Thank you very much for joining us today for this long session, actually. It was really, really nice. And we started to discuss, Breno and I before, and then André and I, the possibility of publish that as an interview.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
I knew that I should have guessed there would be a downside to this. Wonderful. Exactly.
okay, we can talk about that later.
Later,
John.
yeah.
We'll talk about that. I remember when I came to Santa Catarina and I thought I was having an informal conversation with Breno, and it turned out that it was published as an interview.
Yeah, we tend to do that. I guess it's our bad habit, but yeah.
But we can think about it.
Okay. All right. Let's think about it. Good.
But indeed, it was a wonderful and pleasant conversation. Thank you, Sid.
I enjoyed it very much. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.